There is a particular kind of lie that should be impossible to sustain. Not a lie about intentions or projections or the future. Those can hide forever in the fog of what might be. This was a lie about a machine, a physical object sitting on a table that either did what it claimed or did not. And for nearly 15 years, that object failed to do the one thing it was built to do, while the company around it swelled to a valuation of almost $9 billion. The device had a name. They called it the Edison, after the great American inventor, and the choice was not accidental. It was meant to conjure a lineage of genius, of lone brilliance bending the physical world. The Edison was supposed to take a single prick of blood, a droplet drawn from a fingertip, and from that tiny sample run hundreds of diagnostic tests. Cholesterol, cancer markers, infection, everything a full vial of blood and a room full of laboratory equipment could reveal, compressed into a box you could set on a countertop in a drugstore. Its founder described it as the iPod of healthcare. The comparison was deliberate, and it was seductive. What if the entire $60 billion laboratory industry, the LabCorps and the Quest Diagnostics, the needles and the waiting rooms, what if all of it could be replaced by a slim, elegant machine and a drop of blood no larger than a tear? There was only one problem. It never worked. Not almost worked. Not worked with errors. It could not perform its central promise, because that promise ran directly into the walls of physics and chemistry. When you shrink dozens of different testing components into a small enclosure, they interfere with one another. The heat, the light, the electrical activity of one bleeding into the next. And when you take that tiny fingerprick sample and dilute it enough to run multiple tests, you push the measurements outside the range the hardware can even detect. The very thing that made the vision beautiful, smallness, a single drop, was the thing that made it impossible. By one internal accounting, the Edison could reliably handle only a dozen tests out of 250. And even those produced results that swung wildly, unpredictably, dangerously. So this is where our story begins. Not with a villain, not yet, but with a paradox. A company built entirely around a device that could not do its job. And a founder who, faced with that failure, did not stop, did not pause, did not tell the truth. She built a second machine, larger, called the Mini Lab, the next iteration of a dream that kept refusing to become real. And she kept selling the dream anyway. Over the coming chapters, we are going to trace exactly how that was possible. Not through rumor or hindsight, but through a specific evidentiary spine. The sworn testimony given under oath in a federal courtroom, and the filings the Securities and Exchange Commission would eventually compile. Because the fraud here was not abstract. It was made of concrete acts. Fake demonstrations, staged for investors, where a person's blood was drawn in plain view and then quietly carried away to be processed by hand or by someone else's commercial machine out of sight. Falsified data prepared for regulators. Test results altered, contradictory readings hidden, poor outcomes made to disappear on command. And the central lie was almost childlike in its simplicity, that a single drop of blood, drawn from a finger, was being run inside that box. That single claim, a lie you could disprove by watching a technician's hands, survived investors who wired in hundreds of millions of dollars. It survived a board of former secretaries of state and generals. It survived journalists, and it survived, for a shockingly long time, the regulators whose entire job was to catch it. Which leaves us with the question that will follow us through everything that comes next. It is the question that makes this story more than a scandal and turns it into a kind of mirror. How does a physical impossibility get hidden, repeatedly, deliberately, in plain sight? How does an unworkable machine, sitting right there on the table, become the foundation of a $9 billion empire? Let's start with the woman who built it. She was 19 years old when she walked away from Stanford. It was 2003, and Elizabeth Holmes had a single, powerful idea that she believed could remake the entire practice of medicine. In her earliest conception, it wasn't even a machine on a counter. It was a wearable patch, something you'd stick to your skin that would continuously read your blood, detect problems as they emerged, and deliver medication in real time. A microscopic laboratory, always watching, always working. That original vision tells you something important about Holmes. She did not begin small. She began with the impossible and worked backward. And along the way, she discovered a story so seductive that people stopped asking whether the science underneath it actually held. The story was about fear. Almost everyone, at some point, has flinched at a needle. Holmes built her entire pitch around that flinch. Forget the vial after vial of blood drawn from your arm. Forget the trip to a clinic and the days of waiting. Imagine instead a single prick of the finger, one drop, painless, nearly instant, and from that drop, hundreds of laboratory tests. She spoke about a childhood dread of needles, about the human cost of medical tests people were too afraid to take. It was intimate, it was universal, and it was, above all, easy to sell. The founding myth did its work quickly. Within her first year, Holmes had turned an initial seed investment of roughly $1 million into nearly $6 million. Investors weren't buying a finished product. They were buying a feeling, the sense that they were early to something inevitable. And Holmes reinforced that feeling by moving fast on patents, filing early and often, staking legal claim to a device that did not yet exist in any working form. And here is where the trouble begins, right at the source. Because the founding myth was not just a marketing narrative. It was the first piece of scaffolding in a much larger structure of fabrication. The promise, one drop, hundreds of tests, outran the technology from the very first day. Not by a little, by a chasm. To understand why, you have to understand what a drop of blood actually is. A finger prick yields a tiny volume, and that sample is not clean. It's contaminated with fluid from the surrounding tissue, and it's simply too small to divide across dozens of separate tests. So Theranos did the only thing it could do. It diluted. It took that tiny sample and thinned it out to stretch it further. But dilution is not a free trick. When you water down a blood sample, you also water down the very things you're trying to measure, the proteins, the markers, the traces of disease. You push them down below the threshold that the hardware can even detect. The dilution meant to solve the volume problem actively manufactured a new one, inaccuracy, baked in at the chemical level. And it got worse when they tried to shrink the machine. Running many different tests requires many different components, each with its own chemistry. Crowd them all together into a small box, and they begin to interfere with one another. Heat bleeding from one process into the next, light contaminating readings, electrical activity throwing off delicate measurements. The miniaturization that was supposed to be the miracle was, in engineering terms, a nightmare of interference. None of this was a mystery discovered years later by outside investigators. These were physical realities, understood internally, early. The scientists working the problem could see the numbers. They could see the erratic results. The limits were not hidden from the people building the device. They were hidden from everyone else. That is the pattern that will define this entire story. And it is the same pattern the SEC would eventually lay out in painstaking detail years down the line. Aspiration presented as achievement. A goal described as a result. A machine that might someday work, spoken about as a machine that already did. From day one, there were two Theranos running side by side. The one Elizabeth Holmes described to the world, and the one that actually sat on the bench, failing. The distance between those two would only grow. To understand how that distance was hidden, you have to understand the demonstration. Because a demonstration is theater, and Theranos was very, very good at theater. Here's how it worked. An investor would arrive at the company's headquarters. They would be greeted, walked through gleaming offices, and eventually introduced to the device itself. A sleek black box, softly glowing, humming with the quiet confidence of a machine that knew what it was doing. Then came the moment everyone remembered afterward. Someone would prick the investor's finger, or the finger of a guest, and collect a tiny drop of blood into a small cartridge. That cartridge would be loaded into the machine. A door would close, lights would blink, and a short while later, results would appear. It was clean. It was intimate. It felt like the future arriving in real time. And almost none of it was real. According to testimony later given under oath, the machines in those demonstrations frequently could not complete the tests they were pretending to run. The hardware failed. Samples produced errors. The device would encounter a problem and generate an error message, the kind of message that would instantly betray the entire illusion if an investor happened to see it. So the company made sure investors never did. Employees described demonstration software that had been specifically modified for exactly this purpose. When a device hit an error during a demo, the software was engineered to hide it. The screen would not display a failure. It would not show a machine struggling. Instead, the error was suppressed, quietly, behind the glass, and the visitor watching would see nothing but the calm progress of a device apparently doing its job. In some cases, the machine would simply be made to appear as though it was still working, running through the motions, while the real result, the failure, was buried where no one could find it. But suppressing errors only solved half the problem. If the device couldn't actually produce a reliable result, where did the numbers on those investor reports come from? Sometimes, they came from somewhere else entirely. In the most damning version of the deception, the blood was collected in front of the investor with all the appropriate ceremony. The prick, the cartridge, the little vial handed off to a technician. The investor watched their own blood disappear into the process, and that act of witnessing was the whole point. They believed they had seen it happen. But once the sample left the room, it did not go into an Edison at all. It was quietly walked to a laboratory bench and processed by hand, or run on a commercial analyzer built by another company. Machines from manufacturers like Siemens, the very industry giants Theranos claimed to be replacing. Think about the audacity of that. The company whose entire pitch was that it had rendered the old laboratory obsolete was secretly relying on the old laboratory to generate the numbers it showed to the people funding its revolution. The blood the investor watched being drawn, and the result the investor was eventually handed, had almost nothing to do with each other. In between sat a black box that was mostly a prop. And the reason this worked, the reason it worked on sophisticated financiers, on retail executives, on people who had built careers on due diligence, is that almost none of them asked to see the raw data. They asked to see the demonstration. And the demonstration was designed to be seen, not examined. The choreography did the persuading. The glowing device, the closed door, the single drop of blood, the tidy result on the screen. It told a complete story, and the story was so compelling that few people thought to interrogate the machinery underneath it. That was the genius, if you can call it that, of the deception. It did not rely on convincing anyone of a difficult technical claim. It relied on staging a moment so smooth and so confident that questioning it would have felt almost rude. The theater was the technology. The performance was the product. And behind the curtain, the real Theranos kept failing, quietly, invisibly, one suppressed error at a time. Because when the demonstrations ended and the investors went home, someone still had to put the promises on paper. And paper, unlike a live demo, leaves a trail. The story that Theranos told about itself was built on documents, validation reports, technical assessments, official-looking pages that claimed the technology had been examined and approved by serious institutions. These were the credentials that turned a nervous pitch into a sure thing. And according to what later emerged in SEC filings and in the accounts of people who worked inside the company, some of those credentials were manufactured. The most striking allegation concerns the reports handed to pharmaceutical partners and to investors. Theranos circulated validation studies that carried the logos of major drug companies, implying, to anyone flipping through the pages, that firms like Pfizer had tested the technology, evaluated it, and put their name behind the results. But those companies had done no such thing. The logos, it was alleged, had simply been added to reports that Theranos itself had written. A borrowed emblem at the top of a page, and suddenly an in-house document read like an independent endorsement from one of the most respected names in medicine. To a potential investor, that was everything. You did not have to understand blood chemistry. You only had to see a familiar corporate seal and assume that people smarter than you had already done the hard work of checking. The document did the convincing that the machine could not. And this was not an isolated flourish. It was a pattern. Investor materials claimed the technology had been validated by the FDA, embraced by pharmaceutical companies, even deployed by the United States military on the battlefields of Afghanistan. Johns Hopkins Medicine would later state plainly that it had never collaborated with Theranos at all, despite the company's public suggestions to the contrary. One by one, the pillars of legitimacy turned out to be painted on. But the deepest rot was not in the marketing. It was in the laboratory itself, in the routine tests that clinical labs are required to pass to prove they can produce accurate results. This is called proficiency testing. Regulators send known samples, the lab runs them, and the numbers reveal whether the equipment can be trusted. It is the immune system of the entire industry, the mechanism designed to catch exactly the kind of failure Theranos was hiding. So Theranos, according to former employees, found ways around it. When those proficiency samples arrived, rather than running them on the Edison, the machine the whole company was supposedly built upon, staff were pushed toward the commercial analyzers Theranos had quietly bought from other manufacturers. And even that came with a catch. A finger prick produces only a tiny volume of blood, far less than those commercial machines were designed to handle. So the samples were diluted, stretched thin to fit the hardware. And dilution, as the scientists in that lab well knew, dragged the measurements into a range where they became unreliable, below the threshold the instruments could accurately read. The people who understood this raised their hands. Lab personnel warned that the results could not be trusted, that patients were receiving numbers pulled from a process that was fundamentally broken. And those warnings were overridden. The message from above was not caution but concealment. Poor results were to disappear, uncomfortable data was to be smoothed away, and the machinery of validation was to keep producing the appearance of success. What all of this created was a paper trail, a documented record, later reconstructed by regulators and journalists, of a company that had learned to fabricate the one thing it could not actually build: proof. Every altered report, every borrowed logo, every diluted sample run on a machine Theranos claimed to have replaced, each one added another layer of false legitimacy over an empty core. And it worked, for a time, because a document feels like fact. A report with the right seal, a validation study with the right signatures, a proficiency result that passes. These are the objects we treat as truth in a world too complex to verify ourselves. Theranos understood that better than almost anyone. It didn't need to make the science work. It only needed to make the paperwork say it had. But paperwork alone cannot raise nearly $1 billion. For that, you need people to vouch for you. And not just any people. You need names so heavy that their mere presence ends the conversation before it starts. Consider the board Elizabeth Holmes assembled. It read less like the leadership of a medical laboratory and more like the guest list of a state dinner. Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, 2 former secretaries of state, James Mattis, a decorated general who would one day run the Pentagon. These were men who had shaped foreign policy and commanded armies. What they had not done, not one of them, was work in diagnostics, biochemistry, or clinical laboratory science. They could evaluate a treaty. They could not evaluate the accuracy of a blood assay. And that was, in a strange way, the point. Their expertise was irrelevant to the technology, but their authority was priceless to the story. When an investor saw those names on the letterhead, the message was unmistakable. Serious people have looked at this, and serious people have approved. Except they hadn't, not in any way that mattered. They had approved of Elizabeth Holmes. They had been charmed by a poised young founder who spoke of saving lives, who lowered her voice into a deliberate baritone, who wore the black turtleneck of the man who had reinvented the world. They vouched for a person. The world heard them vouching for a machine. George Shultz believed so completely that when his own grandson, Tyler, came to him with evidence of fraud, evidence gathered from inside the company, the elder statesman sided with Holmes. He trusted her more than his own family. That is not the behavior of a man performing diligence. That is the behavior of a man who has fallen under a spell. The investors fell the same way, and here the failure becomes almost dizzying. Rupert Murdoch put in $125 million. The Walton family, the heirs to Walmart, $150. The DeVos family, roughly $100 million. Partner fund, $94 million. These were not naive amateurs. They commanded some of the most sophisticated financial operations on Earth. And yet, again and again, the basic step was skipped. Nobody demanded to see the technology validated by an independent lab. Nobody insisted the Edison run their blood in front of them, start to finish, no hands touching it. Why not? Partly because each believer validated the next. Murdoch invested because the Waltons had. New money looked at the marquee names already committed and reasoned that surely someone in that crowd had checked. It was a chain of trust in which every link assumed the strength of every other, and no single link ever bore the weight of actually verifying the core claim. The $9 billion valuation was not built on data. It was built on a circle of powerful people each pointing at the others. Secrecy sealed it shut. Every refusal to explain, every closed door, Every question deflected with a wave toward trade secret protection. Holmes reframed as the natural caution of a company guarding a revolutionary invention. Silicon Valley had trained everyone to expect exactly this. Genius is protective. Disruptors are paranoid for good reason. The very evasions that should have alarmed people were interpreted as proof of how much there was to protect. And then the fabrication left the boardroom and reached real patients. Walgreens and Safeway, drawn in around 2010, committed enormous sums, combined roughly $105 million in investment and loans, with Safeway alone pouring $350 million into remodeling stores for machines that did not work. Theranos handed Walgreens a list of 192 tests the Edison could supposedly perform. Barely half were even theoretically possible. But the retail giants did not run their own experiments either. They, too, trusted the names, the story, the paperwork. So the illusion survived, not because it was hidden from smart people, but because smart people had every incentive to keep believing, and no one was willing to be the first to break the spell. And yet, spells break not from the outside, but from within. The people who finally cracked Theranos open were not rivals or short sellers. They were young scientists who had believed the story most of all, who had signed on to change medicine and instead found themselves staring at machines that could barely hold themselves together. Tyler Shultz was one of them. The grandson of a board member, a Stanford biology graduate, he had every reason to want Theranos to succeed. Instead, he watched Edison devices with parts that fell off mid-test, doors that refused to close, temperature controls that spiraled out of control. He saw patient results that changed wildly when the same sample was run again, and he learned that patients were never told their blood had been quietly retested. When he raised his concerns directly with Holmes by email, the answer came instead from Sonny Balwani, who called him arrogant, ignorant, and reckless. In the spring of 2014, Tyler reported the company to the New York State Department of Health, using a false name to protect himself. The regulator's response was blunt. What he was describing was not standard laboratory practice. It was cheating. That same year he resigned, and Erika Cheung, the young Berkeley graduate who had watched contradictory results flow out to real patients, walked away not long after. But leaving was not the end of it. Theranos hired private investigators to shadow anyone suspected of talking. Tyler's own grandfather, George Shultz, sided with Holmes over the family's warnings, so deep was his faith in her. Then, in February of 2015, a tip reached John Carreyrou, an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal. He began pulling threads. He found former employees willing to describe, on the record and off, what the machines actually did and what they did not. He learned about the staged demonstrations, the samples secretly processed by hand, the falsified data submitted for regulatory review. Holmes fought back hard. She dispatched lawyers. She had the company surveil sources. She even went to Rupert Murdoch himself, a man who had invested $125 million in Theranos and who owned the newspaper, and personally asked him to kill the story. Murdoch, to his credit, refused. He let his reporter do his job. On the 15th of October, 2015, the first article ran. It landed like a hammer. Theranos, the piece revealed, was performing fewer than 1 in 10 of its tests on the Edison machines it had built its entire mythology upon. The rest were quietly run on the same commercial analyzers made by the very companies Holmes claimed to be disrupting. The turtleneck, the baritone, the Steve Jobs theater, all of it had been draped over a hollow promise. The rumors were now documented. And once the wall of secrecy cracked, everything behind it came pouring through. Federal regulators from CMS descended on the company's laboratory with surprise inspections. What they found was so alarming that they declared the facility posed in immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. This was no longer a matter of business ethics. It was a question of harm. Real people, real diagnoses, built on numbers no one could trust. The consequences arrived in waves. Nearly 1 million Theranos test results were voided, wiped away as unreliable. Using the technology on Walgreens customers was later described, plainly, as an unauthorized medical experiment. Walgreens sued and settled for a fraction of its investment. The DeVos family and Rupert Murdoch each swallowed losses north of $100 million. Then in March of 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Elizabeth Holmes and Sonny Balwani with massive fraud. Holmes settled without admitting guilt, surrendered control of her company, and paid a $500,000 fine. Balwani chose to fight the charges. And later that year, the company that had once been valued at nearly $10 billion, the darling of Silicon Valley, the youngest self-made female billionaire's crown jewel, quietly dissolved. The Edison, the iPod of healthcare, would never disrupt anything. It simply ceased to exist. And a federal criminal investigation was only just beginning.